We have a quorum. We're now in public session. We've apologies received from. Can I just thank my colleague Joe Corry for stepping in as temporary chair in my absence last week and expressing sympathy from you all and passing of my dad and uncle. Thank you. So we're dealing with issues affecting the aviation sector. I would like to welcome to today's meeting Mr. Chris Horn, former chair of the Aviation Task Force. Welcome, Mr. Horn. We have you visually. Mr. Pat Dawson, CEO of the Irish Travel Agents Association, and Mr. Paul Hackett, board member, Irish Travel Agents Association. I want to welcome you both to the committee. Before we begin, members are reminded that this meeting must have concluded and everyone must have vacated the room by 1:30. So I will be drawing people to order at 1:25 so everyone is out by 1:30. And I'm as frustrated as everyone else by COVID, but we have to, on public health grounds, abide by that particular criteria. Note and privilege, before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, you continue to do so. You are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect to your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make any charges against any person, persons or entities by name or in such a way as to make him or her or it identifiable. I wish to advise the witnesses giving evidence from location outside the parliamentary precincts, that applies to you, Mr. Horn, to note that the constitutional protection afforded to witnesses attending to give evidence before committees may not extend to them. No clear guidance can be given as to whether or to the extent to which the evidence given is to be covered by absolute privilege of a statutory nature. Persons giving evidence from another jurisdiction should be mindful of their domestic statutory regime. If you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, you must respect that direction. I presume you understand that, Mr. Horn. And members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on or criticise or make charges against a person outside of the houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I would now call on Mr. Horn to make your opening statement. Mr. Horn.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I inform the audience?
1 second there, Mr. Horn. We might be able to, we want to get the volume up just slightly. We can't hear you properly. Are we okay there? Mr. Horn, you might proceed.
Your microphone is muted there.
Your microphone is muted. The microphone.
You need to tell him again. Your microphone is muted. Right.
Can you see us?
For a technology guru, he's struggling today.
Do you have a text for him? Oh. He can hear us. Could you speak, Mr. Horn? Your microphone is muted. Mr. Horn, can you hear us? So he should be able to hear us. To Mr. Pat Dawson, CEO of the Irish Travel Agents Association. We'll come back to Mr. Horn then. Mr. Dawson?
Mr. Hackett is making the opening statement.
Mr. Hackett, yes, a board member of the Irish Travel Agents, might make your opening statement. And in the meantime, we'll make that connection with Mr. Horn. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee members. The Irish travel industry directly employs approximately 3,500 people across 26 counties. This is a mainly Irish-owned SME business sector, with many high street shops in rural and regional towns, as well as concentrations in the larger cities. The industry is regulated by the Commission for Aviation Regulation, offering additional financial and consumer protection for those booking travel services via a travel agent. Turnover across the sector was approximately 1.4 billion per annum, and the Irish Travel Agents Association are the representative body for the industry. Travel agents serve both corporate and leisure markets with the full range of outbound travel services. The ITAA is deeply concerned about the impact the COVID-19 crisis is having on the wider travel sector and Irish travel agents. The travel industry is unique because, number one, trading is 90 to 95% down since March and will continue at that level of trading for the foreseeable future because of the messaging around non-essential travel. Travel companies have had to remain open to service customers with cancellations, refunds and rebooking. The companies could not close down even though they were effectively blocked from trading, and they have had to continue to carry a proportion of salary and all overhead costs. Travel agents have had to engage in negative trading due to the refund requirement on the business that was secured in 2019 and early 2020. The industry expectation was towards a resumption after 6 months, but we currently have no reopening date. We require a compensation package to partially cover running costs. We need infrastructure put in place to allow international travel to recommence, which complies with health guidelines and keeps passengers safe. Travel agents are the only industry sector in Ireland which is both regulated through our licence and bonded for consumer protection. The ITAA welcomed the publication of the Aviation Recovery Task Force report published in July and the recommendations within. However, the association had anticipated that the interim recommendations of the task force would be implemented by government following its publication on June 22nd. This has not been done. We need government adoption of the EU traffic light system, and we need Ireland to follow the rest of the EU with the implementation of that system. The task force emphasises the urgency of a plan to economically coexist with the virus, and as an island nation, this has to include international travel. The ITAA reiterates the urgency of this and fellow EU member states with a conscious reopening of international travel. While much ITA business relates to outbound travel, the nature of the aviation sector means that the outbound and inbound sectors are inherently linked. The Irish Travel Agents Association supports the promotion of aviation and regional airports to save Ireland's tourism sector and, by extension, its economy. Travel agents, as the vital element in outbound travel, will do our utmost to contribute to promoting foreign travel. Our role in promoting outbound travel complements the efforts of others to promote inward travel. On the proposed EU traffic light system, the ITAA welcomed that the government has committed to EU-wide rules for a traffic light system aimed at... How much more? 30 seconds. Okay. Aimed at opening our skies. Most EU airports are operating safely with additional structural supports, and the ITAA are of the opinion that the Irish airports will be permitted to follow with our neighbouring EU airports. On COVID testing, first and foremost, the safety and comfort of our customers is paramount to all member agents. We have called for the development and implementation of routine COVID-19 testing for passengers boarding flights out of the country, as this will ensure a clean environment throughout the travel process. Evidence has shown it significantly reduces the spread of the illness. The ITA believes that this testing will help rebuild consumer confidence in travel. The DAA can roll out testing within days in Dublin and Cork airports, delivering 15,000 screenings daily, and this will need state assistance. I wish to thank the committee for their interest, and we will welcome questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hackett. Mr. Horn, can you hear us now? For fuck's sake.
You see, Chris, whoever Chris is there, he's muted as well.
Can you hear me now?
Here we go.
Mr. Horn, you can proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Senators, Deputies. Thank you for inviting me this morning. I provided a brief opening statement to you. I should note at the outset I have no direct involvement whatsoever in the aviation sector. My background is really in software engineering and entrepreneurship. I was contacted by the former Minister of Transport, Mr. Shane Ross, in early June asking whether I would consider acting as a neutral chairman from outside of the aviation sector for the aviation task force which he was putting together. And having reflected, I agreed to do so. He emphasised to me the urgency with which we should undertake our work and the speed at which we should come up with our recommendations. The members of the task force were invited by the Minister. I had no involvement in putting the task force together. And some of my colleagues in the task force, I believe, have already spoken to you, and perhaps in the future there are further members too. I don't know your own agenda. We had 4 meetings in early June, mid-June, and finishing on the July the 3rd. We produced an interim report after 2 weeks and a final report after a further 2 weeks. Our work was very intense. We worked with the Secretariat over weekends to produce our recommendations. I would hope that deputies and senators have had an opportunity perhaps to visit our report, and particularly the final report, and look at our recommendations. I will not repeat them here. We then presented our reflections to the Ministers Ryan and Minister of State Hildegard Naughton on the 10th of July, and subsequently to a broader audience, including the Secretary to the Government in late July. The task force has not met since that last meeting, and in effect has ceased its work. My only comment as somebody from outside of the sector and working with young startups is how important aviation is to us as an economy. A small nation on the periphery of Europe, there's a certain amount that can be done by calls, by virtual calls like this, Zoom and GoToMeeting and so on. But for new business development, for trying to win new customers, trying to raise international finance, trying to hire new international staff, develop new partnerships, it's virtually impossible to do that just with virtual conference calls. Face-to-face meetings are important. And business, after all, is done between people, not between companies, and establishing new business relationships, one needs that personal contact. It's extremely difficult, I think, and frustrating for companies based in Ireland, indigenous companies based in Ireland with export markets, that their competitors overseas are able to travel more freely than we are in this country at this point, and that places further stress on the high potential technology startup sector. With that, Chairman, thank you again to the committee for the invitation. Thank you to you, sir, for inviting me. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Horn. We'll now proceed to questions. 7-minute rounds for individual parties. Senator Buttimer.
As Chair,
I'm quite happy for you.
No, I'm happy to share with you. I'm open. Okay.
Let you proceed. Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, just to welcome our guests, our witnesses, and thank them. Could I ask Mr. Horn a number of questions? First of all, in the context of your task force, first question is, do you think that the task force should be reconvened, given that we have an ambiguity around the implementation of the task force recommendations? Secondly, in your remarks to us, you prepared remarks, you speak about new business development, new customers, existing customers. In the context of the presentations we've heard this morning and the precariousness of travel, how would you see us as a committee working with government to, first of all, ensure that we can have adequate testing, and secondly, to restore confidence in the travelling public? Notwithstanding your remarks around new business development, new customers and existing customers, and in your meeting, which you you said the task force has not convened since 30th of July, and you had a meeting on the 10th of July. What has your engagement been with government since the 10th of July, if any? And to our 2 witnesses present, can I thank them for being here? I know that they are under severe pressure, Chairman. I've been in contact with a number of travel agents myself, who have expressed to me a number of issues regarding engagement with airlines. From your presentation today, you're talking about in the last paragraph of the first page, in terms of the task force would be implemented by government following its publication. This has not been done. What specifically should we be, from a committee perspective here, pushing around the task force? In the context of the European Council directive this Monday, there seems to be ambiguity again around travel in terms of green, amber and red. And could I ask for your perspective on that? And the budget yesterday, from your perspective as travel agents who are, as you rightly said, dealing with the travelling public, dealing with airlines, and your position is far more complicated, in my opinion, than others, because you are getting it on both ends of the extreme, with little or no recourse to support, in my opinion. Yeah, okay, that's okay. I'll conclude on that. Thank you.
Mr. Horn.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Senator. Should the committee reconvene? Possibly so. I think that would be at the invitation of the government to do so. I would think perhaps the first item that were to reconvene would be to review the recommendations that were made and the current status of their implementation, one way or the other. Moving on then to, Senator, your comments about winning new customers in the current environment, testing and travel. I think that the question would be, if we have various actions like the green list and quarantining and better test and trace, does it overall address and help address this issue of how can the business community travel to extend and grow their businesses? That's the fundamental issue I see from the sector that I'm most familiar with. Finally, in fact, our last meeting was on the 30th of July, not the 10th of July. On the 10th of July, we met with Ministers Ryan and Hildegard Naughton. On the 30th of July, we met with the Secretary of the Government and other senior officials. We have not, I personally have not had any interaction with government since the 30th of July, to answer your question.
Mr. Dawson.
I'll speak. Thank you for the question. As far as the Irish travel agents are concerned, we're in a desperate situation as such. And as the Senator says, we're getting both sides of it from everywhere. We have awful issues with refunds. We're owed roughly about 20-25 million, and that is the consumer that's owed that type of money. From a point of view of where do we go from here, travel needs certainty. And we certainly have no certainty whatsoever. We had a green list, and there were 4 countries on it with 2 with no airports. Then we suddenly opened up to 10 or 12 countries, and there was silence about that, because we felt that the government was not interested in pursuing the green list. Otherwise, they would have spoken about the 10 or 12 countries that were to open up. So now what we have to do is we have to agree with our European counterparts that we're all on the same page and the same colour. And we don't want a patchwork situation, as airlines have complained this morning about, that we can't have a country, green, orange or whatever it is, because the travelling public need certainty, and that's what we haven't got at the moment. I'll ask Paul, maybe he'd address the budget situation and what our aspects are on that, Paul.
And just coming back on Pat's point with regard to certainty and consumer certainty, I think one of the key things that came out of the Aviation Task Force reports, one of the key things that came out from the Council and the Commission yesterday that will provide certainty and allow for the removal of quarantine is the provision of adequate testing. It's critical, because we don't have that in the current traffic light system of green, orange and red. It can change at a whim. There's too many moving parts to it. It's too confusing. We really have to look and apply not only the testing regimes that we have for ourselves in this country, but we have to have that at airports if it's going to work effectively. With regard to the question on the budget and how that helps, the COVID restrictions support scheme would be very welcome. We absolutely need clarity that the travel industry fits within that sector, and we also need clarity with regard to the fact that, you know, we can talk about level 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Effectively, the travel industry has been at level 5 since March. We have been locked down since March and we have been open since March. So we can't have a scenario whereby it is a requirement for the travel industry to be at level 3 in order to be receiving those supports, because effectively trading has been at minus 95%. So no other industries like that.
And if I could add,
a few seconds.
We do business when non-essential travel is not there. So the government are saying we've no non-essential travel there. That means we're not doing any business, and that's since March. The levels to 1 to 5 make no difference to us. Level 1 or 5 to 5, it's all the same. We're not doing any business once it's non-essential travel.
Thank you, Mr. Dawson. Can I just ask the witnesses, the 7-minute clock applies for the entire, between the question and the responses. And it's in COVID times, I know it's very difficult. Who's taking the slot for Fianna Fáil? Deputy Crowe? 7 minutes between the witnesses. So I'd ask both witnesses and questioners to keep an eye on the clock in the right-hand corner.
Thank you, Chairman. Just at the outset, I want to welcome our witnesses to the Chamber here this morning. It's good to have this engagement, and I hope it'll be more ongoing, because I don't think, whilst the crisis and the sectors are being supported through this crisis, I don't think your troubles have ended, and I'm sure you'll articulate that very strongly yourselves. On June the 3rd, I spoke in the Dáil, and I want to begin by addressing Mr. Horn. On June the 3rd, Mr. Horn, I spoke in the Dáil and asked the then Minister Shane Ross to introduce an aviation task force, and I'm glad that he and his department initiated that and that you chaired that effort. There were certainly some positives in it. I had some difficulties with the constitution of the task force, and that wasn't of your doing, but I felt that there were certain omissions, namely the workers as well. I don't think they were adequately represented on the task force, and a lot of issues transpired in that. Particularly, we saw both the Aer Lingus and Ryanair workers, and indeed those in Shannon Airport who faced 20% pay cuts, who felt that their only representation was that of unions at the time, whereas senior management had another layer of engagement, that being the task force and direct access to the minister. I think there were a number of shortcomings, and I'd like to hear your opinions on it, but a number of shortcomings, I believe, of the task force. They really looked at getting planes back in the sky, and I suppose that is where aviation has to restart again. There isn't an aviation sector, there isn't a travel and tourism sector unless you flights in and out of Ireland. But the shortcomings, as I see it, were they didn't address the gross imbalances that we have in Irish aviation, where last year, in a normal trading year, 32.7 million people came in and out of Dublin Airport, 1.6 million through Shannon Airport. And in the second quarter of this year, 155,000 through Dublin Airport, and just 120 passengers through Shannon. So that's a huge imbalance. It was there last year, it's there this year, it's more augmented this year, and I don't think the task force adequately looked at it. The other shortcoming, I would say, is that all stakeholders here have really looked at re-engaging the routes into Europe, and I welcome what happened yesterday with the European Commission, the traffic light system. I don't think we'll see immediate return from it, but I think we will see the airlines being able to plan the routes for the remainder of this year and the spring season. I hope that will benefit the tourism sector as well. I would like to hear, though, Mr. Horn, what he would say in terms of how we re-establish flights back to the US in a meaningful way. Bearing in mind that their R level is way above ours. So I would like him to reflect on that and the imbalances. He might briefly speak on it. And I would ask Mr. Hackett and Mr. Dawson from the travel agency sector, everything that's happened both in the July stimulus, and that's behind us, but what happened in the budget yesterday and the stimuli that have come in again for businesses and tourism, what more would you think needs to be done between now and early spring? Everyone talks about tourism starting on St. Patrick's Day. What more needs to happen between now and then for your sectors? If we could maybe hear from Mr. Horn first, Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Horn.
Thank you, Deputy. Well, Deputy, I thank you for your initiative on June the 3rd in pressing the then Home Minister to establish a task force. The ICTU were represented directly on the task force by invitation of the Minister and were fully participative. But in addition, we did issue an invitation to all interested parties to make written submissions to us, and we had 26 such written submissions. All of these, by the way, were published on the department's website at the time. And as you say, I personally had no involvement in the constitution of the task force. In terms of the imbalance between Dublin Airport and the regional airports, I note this. It's been a historical issue in the country, but I would state that as chairman, I felt that my role was to try and achieve consensus across the committee, and therefore across the task force, and therefore I didn't want any recommendation in the task force recommendations that would not be supported by every member of the task force. And so the recommendations were by consensus. There were differences of opinion, as you would naturally expect, and where there were differences and not consensus, we were unable then to produce recommendations in that respect. In terms of flights to and from the United States, that's absolutely critical for the business sector, and particularly the indigenous business sector. It's incredibly frustrating that the restrictions are, at least the recommendations from government, are no-fly, non-essential travel only. That makes it very difficult for senior managers and leadership in young companies to ask their own teams and staff to travel when the government recommendation is not to fly and non-essential travel only. The lack of connectivity and ability to fly to the United States right now is really hurting the high technology indigenous sector. Thank you.
Mr. Dawson, Mr. Hackett.
Can I just talk about the regional airports as such, and certainly from the point of view of the imbalance, and I agree totally, Deputy, about the imbalance between Cork, Shannon, Dublin and Knock. And these airports are, as you can see, are in very precarious situation. And yes, they got a grant of 10 million yesterday, but unfortunately that probably will not be enough. And those airports have to be supported. And certainly, the fact there are 35 million out of Dublin, and between the two airports, both Cork and Shannon, it comes to about 4 million. And certainly, when we're talking about, less fuel and petrol on roads, this thing of saying it's an easy drive to Dublin from Shannon or Cork, well, let people try that and let them do it in 2.5 hours to Dublin Airport. Certainly that has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed both for outbound and inbound tourism, which is vital to all those regions.
Could I, if I could just use the last few seconds of my speaker time, Chairman, I think this task force needs to reconvene to look at imbalances, and we also need to put up to Ryanair and Aer Lingus. They very intensely lobbied all of us. Now that the European traffic light system is in place, at a minimum we need to see the flights to Heathrow recommencing. We need to see their commitments to routes in and out of Shannon and other airports. But I would really ask, and I'd ask that this committee would push for the task force to reconvene to look at the imbalances that still exist and will prevail into next spring. Thank you, Chair.
What to do is, in that line, we should write to the two airlines, Ryanair and Aer Lingus, and we should write to the other stakeholders, the airlines, the airports, on their view on the traffic system that was announced yesterday in Europe. So I'm absolutely in agreement. Can I now move to the first Sinn Féin speaker? I think it's Deputy Darren O'Rourke. So what I'd ask is for people that the less time you spend in a question, the more time the witnesses have to answer.
Appreciate that, Cahirlock. For Mr. Dawson and Mr. Hackett, can you just outline for us, for the committee's benefit, the experience of travel agents during the COVID period? I think there are some particular aspects of your business model and the way that your cash flow works, for example, that is unique to the sector. So the idea of, and I've heard from travel agents, negative revenue. I've heard from travel agents who've remortgaged their homes to keep their business up and running. But at the same time, we hear from senior ministers about the protections that are there. There's a suggestion that travel agents are buffered because of the bonded scheme at a European level for package holidays. So just to outline your experience.
With regard to the whole position, the travel industry is incredibly unique with regard to the COVID crisis since March. Effectively, on the 1st of March, business stopped.
and we've been operating at -90 to -95 to -100% in a lot of cases. Unlike the pubs, we can't close and shutter up and send our people home because of bookings being ongoing and bookings being right the way through the season. They all have to be handled, and this is across the corporate sector, which Mr. Horn refers to, as well as the leisure sector and the entire visiting friends and relatives market. The question was asked earlier around the July stimulus package, which was relevant for businesses that were in recovery. We have never been in recovery. We have not seen any uplift since March, and we don't expect to see an uplift until Q1 2021. So that's really where we're at. In terms of what we have engaged with around the cash flow and the refund credit note piece, because maybe that's what you're referring to, we've worked very closely with the Department of Transport during this period to put in place a refund credit note system, which is effectively cash flow, not a cost to the state. What the industry needs is support, because the movement from the temporary wage subsidy to the employment wage subsidy, the measures yesterday that were announced need a lot of clarification that they apply to the travel industry and that they're relevant for the travel industry, and that there is no requirement on the restriction levels in line with tiers 1 to 5. The travel industry is all about customer protection. That's what we do. That's what the bonding and the licensing piece allows us to do. And that's why we're a unique position. We're licensed, we're bonded, we're protected. We're in no way buffered. We're in no way protected because it's our duty to refund our customers, and that's what we're trying to do. The difficulty for us is we're caught in the middle. We're caught between our suppliers and our customers and trying to refund. And the refund credit note effectively was to allow some latitude in that particular area, but all of the members are doing their best to comply with their obligations.
Okay. And just because I would suggest that there is a perception that the sector is buffered because this notion of a protection at a European level. Just so if you could be explicit in terms of, is it the case that that doesn't kick in until companies are literally at the wall?
Effectively, yes. So the Package Travel Directive is the regulation that protects the consumer pan-Europe with regard to travel industry. And the bonding is in place for when a company fails, not beforehand. So only when a company fails does this happen. And it's a tribute to the industry that we have had minimal failures since March to date. And that's because of the resilience of the sector and the fact that this is a very viable sector. It has great bounce back potential. It has been profitable right up to the time of COVID and will be profitable thereafter. But in the interim, the industry is on its knees. There's no question. But there's no buffer to protect us. There has been no handouts. As we said, the July stimulus package was very much for industries that were able to recover. We have not been able to recover. There has nobody seen more than 5% of trading since March.
Okay. Through the chair, I mean, over the last 6 months, the travel agents and tour operators, we've just been burning cash. That's all we've been doing. And we've spent most of our time trying to get refunds from airlines, particularly airlines as such. As I said, we're owed about 25-30 million. And it's taken anything from, remember there is regulation 261 that states that airlines are supposed to refund in 14 days. We know now that airlines are our customers, which we have 400,000 still booked, is taking 4 to 5 months. And even back to March is not refunded yet. And we call and we've been discussing with the Commissioner of Aviation to call in these airlines and say, what are you doing to the public? And they're just ignoring them. But we would ask this committee to call in the airlines, Mr. Chairman, and get the money back to the consumer.
And that's a support I would, that's a call I would support fully and echo, because I would have heard it from scores and hundreds of people of ordinary consumers who are dealing directly with Aer Lingus and Ryanair in particular, and their experience has been a very difficult one and gone back to March. But is that the same experience? Have the travel agents and a better experience, or the same experience, or worse?
The very same experience, and Ryanair particularly are saying now that they won't refund the travel agent, and they've dealt with us for 20 years. So they certainly need to be hauled over the coals and say refund that 25 million to these people, and not having people sending in their utility bills and so forth and so on. And there's another big issue which is very, very important, and that is what we call ghost flights, where flights were flying, because when a flight flies, the 261 does not kick in, so you cannot refund the money. So airlines flew this summer because it was cheaper to fly than cancel the flights, and that's the only reason they fly fly. And we know from people who are on these flights, there's 8 or 10 people on the flights as such, but the airlines have been paid for 70 or 80 of the load factor, so they're still making money. And the government has to look via the Package Travel Directive to see about cancelled flights. If there's no non-essential travel, the flight should be cancelled and the customers refunded their money.
And you estimate that between 25 and 30 million euros is owed via yourselves to customers?
And consumers directly with airlines and cruise companies, because they come into it as well.
Okay. And just in the I think that's an important point that we should follow up on, Cathaoirleach. Just in the final few seconds, in terms of your ask of this committee, in terms of the support package for the sector, what do you need the committee to hear and for the committee to represent the government?
Well, certainly those people who have to pay rates, that's certainly good. The COVID payment, I know it's low, and everyone has their hand out, and you can't pay everyone. And certainly we're hoping, as my colleague Paul said, that we come in under that scheme. We have to come in under that scheme. There are accountants this morning talking to travel agents, and there's a query about that. So that's very, very urgent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My own question time. So, in the limited time I have, just a couple of quick questions. Mr. Horn, what's the unfinished business with the Aviation Task Force? So, if it was to be re-established, what's the unfinished business? Did you look at any traffic light system in Europe, like that's now being proposed, and how quickly could you report back? In terms of the travel agents, just to delve into the 25 to 30 million, is that money that's owed to the travel agents from airlines that they have to refund to consumers, customers of their own? Are they at liberty to say which airlines that involves? What's the level of funding that's required from individual airlines? Because we are getting questions around that area, and certainly we will bring the airlines back in. We obviously know the pressures they're under, we accept that, but there has to be an element of fairness as well. So if you could just deal with those 2 points. Mr. Horn first.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the unfinished business, there were a number of recommendations we made in our final report, and to my knowledge anyway, some of them have not had any follow-up that I'm aware of at government level. So I guess the unfinished business would be to say, are those recommendations accepted? Will they be acted upon? Or are they unacceptable? And if they are unacceptable, why? What is the issue? And how do they need to be addressed? In terms of the traffic light system, absolutely. We did look at the traffic light system, and in our interim report, there was already a recommendation from an EU commissioner that there should be harmony across the EU member states with respect to travel and open travel policy. That was a recommendation made to member states just before our interim report. We acted, in my view, very quickly. There was an intense urgency about our work. We were asked to do so by the former Minister Ross to try and be as quick as we could in producing a thorough set of recommendations. And I believe we did so. I believe over 4 weeks. It was a very intense period with a lot of work. How quickly could we report again? Well, the question would be, to what effect? We've already been asked to move very quickly by government. I believe we did so. It's now been 3 months since we made those recommendations. And as I said, it would appear, at least to me, that some of the recommendations have not been followed through by government to this point.
Mr. Horn, if you were asked to take up the position to re-establish the task force to do an overview, would you take up that position to be chair of such a aviation task force again?
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to understand the terms of reference for reconvening. What would be the objective of reconvening and in what time period? I certainly would give it positive consideration, but I'd just like to understand, if you will, the framework for reconvening. What would be the purpose? What would be the intent, the terms of reference of a reconvening task force?
Thank you, Mr. Horn. Mr. Hackett and Dawson, I want to drill down into the figures. There's been a lot of talk. So specifically, the 25 to 30 million, what it is, what airlines there is involved, what the individual amounts, and just give us a little bit of to flesh out the figures on behalf of the consumer.
Okay, as Pat Dawson has outlined, when flights are cancelled, there's an entitlement to refund, and it's that issue. It's the issue from the airlines to refund the travel agent, and therefore the travel agent to pass on that refund to the consumer. The 25 million would be a conservative number. In terms of the airlines are working through the process. This is, in terms of scale, a massively challenging piece for them, and with respect to most airlines, they are doing their best in a very, very difficult and challenging situation. The airline that is effectively, possibly using some of the legislation that covers this area most is Ryanair. They are calling out EU 261, which is a piece of EU legislation with regard to airlines that requires the airline to refund the customer directly. The difficulty there is that it is almost conflicting with the Package Travel Directive, which provides consumer protection and asks the travel agent to refund the consumer. So we have a loggerhead type situation going on with those two pieces of EU legislation. The legislations sit tandem. They're not designed for the consumer to get double refunds in any circumstances, but there is an issue there. And I think, it's a broader issue with regard to the fact that some of the EU legislation that covers our area is not designed to cope with the pandemic, as is most legislation, possibly because we don't write them in that particular mindset.
What would resolve the situation whereby you specifically mentioned Ryanair, that the issue would be clarified and that there would be no ambiguity around this area?
We have submitted to Ryanair through the Commission for Aviation Regulation in consultation with the Department of Transport documents in the last 2 weeks to say, can we proceed on this basis? And the Commission for Aviation Regulation have set out their understanding of EU 261. So we would ask Ryanair to engage with the Commission for Aviation Regulation on the most recent correspondence that was sent to them at the very end of September, start of October, with the view to resolving this. Because it is really important that we resolve it. There's no point having a shouting match with the airlines.
Would you provide us as a committee with a copy of your submission?
Sure.
So we could follow up with the Commission of Aviation, and also we could follow up with Ryanair.
The submission actually came from the Commission for Aviation Regulation directly to Ryanair. We, as the Irish Travel Agents Association, had direct input into that to try and resolve the matter. So it was a very pragmatic piece of work with review to getting the refund issue resolved. That is the single biggest outstanding area of refund. To some extent, whilst not willing to give excuses to the other airlines, they are working through the trade, they are complying with their regulations and their obligations, and the travel trade is doing its utmost to comply with its rules.
We can follow up with the Commission on Aviation.
We'll do that this afternoon. Yep.
Thank you very much. Senator Dooley.
Thanks very much. Just a couple of questions, just to yourselves, just to Pat and Paul. The COVID support scheme that was talked about in the budget yesterday links those payments to level 3 or above. Now, that would seem to suggest to me that you're not included in that, but you should be, because quite frankly, you've been at level 5 since March. So that you might give us your thoughts on that. To Mr. Horn, thank you very much for the work that you have done. I think there may be some. There's certainly a couple of areas that we need to cover. I think the work that you did was primarily about addressing the immediacy of getting aviation rebooted and restarted in all its forms. To answer your question directly, when you sort of challenged us as to what the terms of reference might be, could I suggest that rather than going back over the work you've done, that the next element of your work would look at how do we ensure a balanced development, a balanced regional aspect to the aviation recovery. So building on what you've already done, to look at the next phase, how do we ensure that as aviation activity recovers, and it will, but it will take some time, that we don't end up with the airlines concentrating on one airport, namely Dublin, effectively with the elimination of all others. So where I think your task force, or a task force under your chairmanship, I would suggest that it will have to have a different set of terms of reference and a very different makeup in terms of who the strategist might be that will report on that. So maybe just get your comments on that, if you could, please, to both parties.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Senator. It was indeed, as you said, Senator, a matter of immediate attention, urgency, and that was the backdrop, I guess, to our work. In terms of regional development, I would note that we did have Shannon Airport represented directly on our committee, and indeed Ireland West through Mr. Joe Gilmore was a member of our task force. In terms of balanced regional development, we did make 2 recommendations in our final report around the way in which regional traffic could be stimulated, including a common fixed sum per passenger, which could be used to stimulate traffic. I do agree that there was a focus on near-term, immediate, urgent actions. Medium-term to longer-term actions were part of our consideration, but perhaps they didn't have the same urgency as we had on short-term and immediate actions, which could impact the industry over the summer and into this winter. Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just come back on that, Mr. Horn. I suppose the piece that I'd like to see looked at would be how you might structure aviation policy into the future. Previously, the 3 state airports operated under the banner of Airline as 3 entities within that umbrella. I'd like to see some consideration given to looking at that again and see if that might be the best model, rather than have this competitive tension that exists at the minute, which is ultimately a non-competitive environment, because Shannon, quite frankly, as an independent entity, albeit state-owned, finds it extraordinarily difficult to compete with the might and the financial might and strength of Dublin, even in good times. The real concern now is that the airlines, working from a very low base, will try to limit to the greatest extent possible a duplication of their activities, and that can only play negatively for other airports. So I think we will have to go back and revisit our entire aviation policy. And that's why I think somebody with yourself, because I really like the idea of you doing the work because of your skill sets, your independence, if it were, from aviation, but somebody who understands enterprise, understands the technology sector, and understands where the demands come from for aviation into this country. So perhaps I might suggest, Chairman, before I conclude, is that this committee would draw up terms of reference for what we see is the next phase, and we might pursue that with the Minister and the Government in an effort to try to get to the next stage of how we might manage a balanced approach to what undoubtedly will be the redevelopment of the aviation sector.
Answering your question regarding level 1 to 5, really you can't have one size fits all as such. As Paul said, the travel industry is unique. So the non-essential travel, we need to speak to Minister McGrath and Pascal O'Donoghue to really get us horned in to that we fit in there. We don't want some technical line in the legislation or the terms and reference that were excluded. So we do business, non-essential travel. We don't do business from 1 to 5 because it doesn't affect us. Once it's non-essential travel, we are told by the government you cannot fly anyone anywhere. So that's as simple as that.
I think I'd reflect what Pat says.
Could I?
Yes, Mr. Horn, yes.
I just had a single sentence comment on Senator's Dooley's last remarks. I understand there was a national aviation policy, a 5-year policy drawn up, I believe it was about 2015 or 16 by the Department of Transport. That 5 years is now concluded. And my understanding is that there is consideration of a new national aviation policy being brought together. It's certainly timely. I'm just observing that the previous policies now expired. That 5-year period is over, so it is timely to reconsider national aviation policy. Thank you, Chairman.
Chairman, just with regard to Deputy Dooley's remarks, the level 3 clarification doesn't apply to the travel industry because of the 95% rule. So we need to understand that if you're trading below 80%, you qualify, irrespective of what level we're at, because that's where the travel industry is. And we think it's quite unique. There's no other industry going to be consistently at that level since it was. We're also slightly concerned about the low turnover levels because our turnovers are artificially inflated in terms of we're buying airfares and buying other services and selling them on, but our margins are tiny. Yeah. So, margins within the industry relative to turnover are also an issue for us because we don't want...
The definition of turnover.
We believe that the spirit of the CRSS policies announced yesterday want to include the travel industry. We just need to make sure that that happens.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Lowry?
Yeah,
be brief. First of all, I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for taking the time, which is obviously informative for us. I've met with the Travel Agents Association on a number of occasions, and I know a lot of the travel people involved in that industry, and most of them are family-run businesses. They're very professional, they're very courteous, they're very organised, and they provide an excellent service. I understand there's 190 of those licensed travel agents around the country, and many of them are in my own constituency of Tipperary, and I've met them on a number of occasions. And effectively what's happening here with the travel agents is that the government advice is not to travel, and thousands of people who have followed that advice have cancelled flights, they've cancelled holidays, and most of those cancellations are package holidays, which would include both the flights, the transfers and the accommodation. So we have this ludicrous situation exists under this European Union directive, whereby the travel agent is legally responsible to secure the refund of the entire package. Now, that's simply not financially sustainable. And the reason it's not financially sustainable, and this is what I'd ask Mr. Dawson or yourself to explain to us, how actually people, the customer out there, the consumer needs to understand. I know that travel agents are suffering some incredible abuse from clients who think that all the travel agent has to do is reach into their bank account and refund the money. As I understand it, the consumer doesn't understand that the travel agent only gets, if he's lucky or she's lucky, get 10% of the entire package. So how can you refund 100% when you're only receiving 10%? It's a total nonsense. And it's a travesty, and it's incredibly unfair to expect travel agents to shoulder the burden of that financial outlay. And the reality is, and I've been told by several of them, that they're going to be forced into liquidation. And as has previously been confirmed, the bonding system to protect the consumer when agencies collapse, that only becomes effective after a travel agent goes into liquidation, which is another nonsense. So travel agents and thousands of consumers across Ireland are effectively caught stranded in the middle between the European Union directive and government advice. And it's been crystal clear to us today in the comment that has been paid. Is actually extraordinary to hear that it's cheaper to fly an almost empty plane rather than cancel the flights and refund the consumers. Now, we've identified the figure and the amount today, but could I ask you to, for the benefit of consumers who are listening and for the benefit of the clients that you represent, could you explain how you operate the system and why it is impossible for you to actually make these refunds?
Yes, Deputy, and thank you, by the way, for speaking for us in the Dáil some time ago, because we rarely heard the word travel agent. In fact, nobody mentioned it yesterday, which was very, very disappointing yesterday. You know, in the hours, it was very, very disappointing, considering that we have met more ministers and all with a very positive attitude towards us. But kindness is no good when it comes to keeping your door open. The situation when you book with a travel agent is it's under the Package Travel Directive, which is an EU legislation. We're responsible from start to finish. And if the package is cancelled or whatever, it doesn't happen because of a pandemic or a world war, no matter what happens, the legislation said we're supposed to refund in 14 days, irrespective of whether we get the money back from the airline, from the hotel. It is absolutely crazy, crazy stuff. There is moves afoot because we're members of ECTA, and I'm on the board of ECTA, which are the European travel agents and tour operators. There is moves afoot to change that legislation, but as Deputy Lowry has said, I mean, it just would close a business tomorrow morning. So what we have to do is we have to fight with our suppliers, be them who, get the money back. The consumer is banging the door down, where is my money, where is my money, because the legislation says pay back the money as such. So our staff all over the country, the 3,500 people, have this banging in both sides of their head, looking for money and trying to get money. It's not sustainable. Something will have to be done. I think the legislation arrived in Ireland without too much thought in it, and is not fit for purpose.
what is the solution to the problem?
Well, the solution to the problem, what many European countries have done is that you book the packages separately. In other words, a package is two elements. So you have a hotel and a flight. So that's a package. Now, if you book a hotel on one day and a flight on the next day, that does not come in. But the point is that our job is to protect the consumer, and that does not protect the consumer. We're the only people in this industry who are there for the consumer 24 hours a day. So we would not be happy with that regime where the consumer is thrown under the bus. We've been thrown under the bus for the last 5 or 6 years as such, but certainly our consumer is our most important weapon we have to keep in business.
If I can just also give some context. The industry is very fast changing. So when the package travel regulations were drawn up, the industry was very different. It was very much charter, tour operator driven. That has now changed. If you look at Ireland, we have two airlines where we have massive dependency, both Ryanair and Aer Lingus, and they're used in what we now call dynamic packaging for package holidays. And holidays have moved from being charter holidays to being part of a scheduled operation. The money comes in from the consumer to the travel agent and goes straight to the airline. And then when something happens with regard to cancellation, it has to work its way back. And that's what the challenge is. When it was charter, the money was effectively sitting in your own house. It was easy to do. So the Package Travel Directive was really designed at a different period in time. The industry has moved on. And as I said earlier, when we have a situation like this, some of the legislation is just very difficult to implement, and it's not for the industry wanting to protect the consumer and wanting to do what it's obliged to do for the consumer.
Well, Chairman, just finally, I think our committee needs recommendations in relation to this area. I mean, it is incredible to think that the travel agent is placed in the middle of this invidious situation and that the airlines are playing puck with everyone. So I think we need, as a committee, to put pressure on the airlines to cooperate and to facilitate the refund of the fund through the Travel Agents Association, because I hear it myself, and I would not like to be in a position at the end of a phone listening to angry, frustrated consumers who are blaming the travel agent, even though it's not the travel agent's fault. They're taking the abuse, and it needs to be resolved.
And Mr. Hackett, on following on from that, on my previous question, the correspondence between the Commissioner of Aviation and Ryanair, is that the kernel to resolving the matter at this moment in time?
For the short term, that would resolve the refund issue. I think it's a bigger piece of work that's involved in looking at the Package Travel Directive and the way the market has changed.
That's a body of work I think Deputy Lowry will undertake as a committee.
Thank you. But I'll make sure that you get that documentation from the Commission.
Thank you. Deputy O'Murray-Coo.
Corry. Yeah, look, in fairness, as regards travel agents, we've all met multiples, and they're in a particularly precarious scenario, and I suppose it's the fact that they're almost in that front line. It's like working in a bank back in the previous economic downturn, where you get blamed nearly for, you know what I mean, somebody sees, why are you not paying me back? And I get the challenges. Now, you mentioned, obviously, as regards being a worse offender of not paying back is Ryanair. I want to know if there are any other airlines that are doing this, and I want to deal specifically with an example that came to me. It was a travel agent that dealt in an awful lot of group bookings, so therefore when he booked the groups, he bought them at different prices in different batches, and some of these were for school kids because it was for school group holidays type scenario. So it created a real difficulty. There could be a huge disparity between the prices. How do you separate it out? And then in an awful lot of cases, you've probably had people, particularly in the early stages, who paid the consumer back straight away while anticipating a quick payback from the airline, which obviously wasn't forthcoming. So look, we need to give you the clarity around the supports. I think that needs to happen straight away. I think we need to take on the scenario around the Package Travel Directive. And the other thing is, in around some of these, as you said, the excuses earlier used by Ryanair of the letter of the law and paying directly back to the consumer. A number of these travel agents would also get accused during this period of being screen scrapers as well. So could you deal with that?
Yep. I might start with the first, or your last point first.
Yeah.
Screen scraping means that we are using data from the airline's website to offer flights. So it's a feed, like a .com website is a public website. In order that we sell holidays using Ryanair flights or Aer Lingus flights, we either have feeds, which are official feeds, or screen scraping, which is effectively taking the data. Now, Ryanair have a particular issue with that, and that is to do with their own distribution policies and their own terms and conditions of their website. And, they're entitled to set those. There's no question about that. It's not, screen scraping in itself is not inherently damaging to the consumer. Effectively, what we're trying to do is provide the consumer with the holiday that they're looking to book and the flights that they're looking to book. And Ryanair are very happy to accept the money. So from a contract law point of view, the names are presented, the price is quoted, the transaction is completed. So there's offer acceptance and consideration. So, there's part of that to go on with it there. In terms of the airlines and the refund piece, it is fair to say that the other airlines are doing their best. It's mainly around the scale of this problem. That's where the challenge is. And the only airline that is trying to sit within 261, and they may have very justifiable reasons for sitting within 261. I'm not a lawyer, but EU 261 sits there for the airline regulation, the aviation sector.
The letter of the law could save them.
Yeah, and the package travel directive sits there for the travel agents. So, there are two pieces of legislation, and currently those two pieces are not working simultaneously to the benefit of the consumer, I think would be the most diplomatic way of putting it. The issue on the groups is a prime example of why the travel agent needs to be refunded. Because in a group situation, you may have a group booking with 20 or 30 or 40 unknown individuals. They could be all different couples going on an escorted tour, or in the case that you quoted, could be a school group. It isn't feasible to return the money to one passenger in the school group. Number one, that person could be underage. They're a minor. So, how does this happen? That is not the case. The school group have come to the travel agent, handed over a deposit, said book us a tour for educational purposes to whatever destination, and put everything together. That's been done. And then, the airline are trying to manoeuvre the scenario to say we have to refund back to the passenger directly. It doesn't work in that situation. It's groups are one example where it doesn't work, and there are plenty of other examples where it doesn't work. It doesn't work in the corporate travel sector, where the company will have paid for the flights for the individual to travel to the destination, and the company's credit card has been used, not the individual passenger who's travelling on to the destination. So there's loads of reasons, and what's unfortunate is up to this particular pandemic, there has been precedent for all of the refunds to go back through the travel agent. Yeah. So this is something new that is being somewhat exploited or used in the current circumstance, which is not helpful.
It's not viable, and it just needs dealt with as quickly as possible. This is probably a wider issue than just in relation to yourself, but an awful lot of some travel agents would be small 1-2 people operations. And I know there was an extension in relation to returns this year, but unless you have your return in on October 31st, if you take the later date, which I think was November, and now it's into December, you have to pay up whatever from 2019, and also preliminary tax for 2020. But people that are under severe pressure, has this come up with any of your members?
Not really as such, because we've no turnover.
Yeah, no, that's it. But therefore, it's going to create difficulties for people like yourself who are absolutely exposed.
Ireland has to be very careful. Ireland, and particularly the smaller airports, that is not dominated by one or two airlines as such, because they will hold them to ransom when it comes to putting on routes, and they won't want to pay their way as such. So Ireland has to be very, very careful. Yes, there is competition out there, and predominantly between, as Paul said, Ryanair and Aer Lingus. And the American carriers, for example, their government told them, by the way, you're not getting any funds from us unless you refund the customers. And that's what they did. The American government, the GOP told them. So from that point of view, we have to have consistency here, and we certainly have to have fair play to the consumer. There are many, many hundreds of thousands of consumers who do not want to book directly with an airline, who do not want to book with the cruise company directly. They want to talk to their local agent in Thurles or wherever they might be.
And the protections that go with it.
And the protection that goes with it. Because remember, airlines are not bonded. Your money is safer with a travel agent than with an airline.
I accept that, and the protections are actually killing yous at the minute, to put it mildly. Yeah, no. What I was talking about is actually it's putting in your tax returns, as I say, and it's a particular difficulty. I'll go with again. I think we definitely have to look at setting terms of reference in relation to the Aviation Task Force. We listened last week in relation to, and I think it's very welcome that the traffic light system is something we're going to operate operate with. But we didn't hear last week in relation to the fact that HICWA are operating pilot schemes at the minute around actually testing facilities that are being run in parallel with PCR at the minute to come up with some sort of solution. We just need to find out a bit more detail about that as a committee, and it needs to happen as soon as possible, while accepting you mightn't necessarily be moving in that direction in the near future.
Okay, thank you very much, Deputy Morocco. Deputy Matthews.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank Mr. Hackett, Mr. Dawson and Mr. Horn for your attendance and for your submissions. I'll go first to the travel agents, and like other deputies I met a lot of travel agents from across Wicklow and South County Dublin all through the pandemic, and for me it was an insight into a business that I knew very little about before this, and it became apparent to me that it's very regulated. There's great safety for people booking through travel agents, and a lot of people get comfort from that, and that the staff engaged in that business are very experienced and offer that level of service and comfort. What was stressed to me in those meetings was that the emergency COVID payments to keep that staff who've been with them for so long was a very, very important aspect of that COVID payment. And to hear you say this morning that there's some concern about that, Mr. Chairman, I think that's something that we really need to get clarity on straight away, because the last thing people who are struggling in that business need is further uncertainty. They need surety to know that the business model that they have is viable but vulnerable, and that's one of the benchmarks we've been putting against COVID payments and emergency payments, is these businesses that need assistance to get through this time that will be viable once we get out of it. So I think that's really important. The second thing is we had the airlines in here last week, and not one single person asked about ghost flights. I find it really incredible and unacceptable that a large, well-funded, sourced business like that would engage in that type of ghost flights in order to get around having to pay refunds out. I find that incredible. I don't know if we need to get the airlines back in here again to ask them that question, but it's definitely something we do need to write to them about. And lastly, just the point that 3,500 jobs, and it also represents 240 shop fronts and businesses across towns and villages in Ireland and cities, and that's really important as well, that we maintain that the viability of those businesses. So I do think we should write to seek clarity, and to the airlines as well on that question. Mr. Horn, if I could move to you on just the submission that you have in the recommendations of your report. Points number 5 and 6 refer to rebates and stimulus, and you have it in there that this would require state aid that be notified to the European Commission for approval in accordance with state aid rules. So has that been done by other European countries, or would you see that as being a barrier? Or has it been done already and done before, and it's just a formality that has to be gone through? And then in point number 9, you make about the government investment in the aviation sector in response to the costs of transition to carbon neutral operations. Could you outline what investments should be made now to assist that transition or offsetting to get to that carbon neutrality? Thank you.
Yeah. To go back to you, Deputy, about the ghost flights. I mean, you know, I'm sorry I wasn't here when those airlines were in here, because I would tell you the truth as such. And please, if they're ever in here again, Paul and I'll be delighted to sit beside you. But worse than that happened throughout the summer. And that is when people who couldn't travel because of non-essential and they wanted to change. These are ordinary families around Ireland. They're going on a precious holiday in school time, paid a lot of money, and the flight was going to go. So what many airlines did, and not all of them, because some are very, very good, they charged families €800 or €900 to change a date. As such, so they really took advantage, and I think not alone this committee, but I think the government needs to stand up and protect the public from that point of view. And it was incredible with families as Deputy Lowry has said, crying on the phone and saying that they have to cancel the holiday because they don't have the €800 or €900 to pay the so-called amendment fees. And there was a lot of profiteering going on when people were down at their lowest, let alone worried about their health, worried about their job, and certainly wanting to fork out several €100 to change when it was profiteering. So certainly there's a lot of work to be done.
I've nothing to add other than just to call out the recognition of this being a really strong SME sector within the Irish economy and the need to protect this sector, because currently we have a very strong Irish, mainly Irish-owned group of travel companies. But there is nothing to stop any travel company anywhere in Europe trading in Ireland and operating out of a .ie or .com and complying with all of the regulations that require them to have the protection for the consumer. But they don't have that person on the ground here, they don't have that Irish employee, they don't have that headcount in Ireland, and that's what's really important, and we want to protect that. As we said before, this is a viable, bounce-backable industry. It has survived and it is really well regulated and licensed, so we do need to make sure we support it, and that comes back into those clarifications that we need from government with regard to the CRSS initiatives announced yesterday.
Mr. Chairman, can I just add about regarding Paul's point about companies? There are many travel companies based outside of the state, and they operate with a Dublin number or .ie email. The people find out then, and there's hundreds of thousands of people involved, they find out that it's a company based in the UK, it's in Netherlands or whatever else. And as we know, if you're not based in Ireland, your legislation goes to where you're based. Sure. So these people have to go to the UK, the CAA, or to the different authorities in Belgium, China, or whatever else. So we really need...
Thanks, Mr. Dawson, sorry to interrupt you, but I would like to just allow I have 1 minute for Mr. O'Horn to answer the 3 questions, and if you could get to the second question first, if possible, about the investments in carbon neutral transition.
Fine. Thank you, Deputy, and thank you, Chairman. Yes, to address the second question first, I think our consideration was it's not just the airlines, it's the entire sector, so it includes the airports and supply chain. So I was looking at that sector as a whole rather than just the actual aircraft. And the feeling was that there are a number of initiatives at European level, I'm sure you're aware of them, from the European Environment Agency, Eurocontrol, the Aviation Safety Regulator with respect to carbon neutrality. And we felt that there was a real opportunity, in fact, for Ireland to lead in this respect by considering a holistic approach to the whole industry and the sector here. So there are a number of initiatives. I want to stress again, it's not just the aircraft, it's you consider the whole industry. With response to our state aid issue, a number of other jurisdictions within the EU have offered and are offering financial incentives to airlines to continue to fly to particular airports, including regional airports, as well as state aid directly to the airlines. And our understanding is that the regulations, EU regulations, require that this is state aid approval, that other nations have gone through this process and received such approval. Understanding that in some cases the EU has waived the requirements for state aid approval, but I may be wrong, that is just a personal view.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Deputy Corry, 7 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chairman. And I'd like to thank our witnesses for their presentation and engagement with the committee. Just to Mr. Horn, I think one of the flaws of the task force report was the fact that the committee didn't look at the imbalance that's there in our national aviation policy. Basically, what you have currently is a very dominant Dublin airport, representing 86% of all passengers in Ireland. Surely, in a post-COVID era, we should be moving away from congestion and giving other airports a chance and reinforcing balanced regional development. I don't know if you were aware of the Limerick Chamber of Commerce report that they published there last year, and which looked at this particular question and looked at other countries where they're grappling with this particular question themselves. And a good case in point would be Schiphol in Holland, where they have an ultra-dominant Schiphol. Government introduced a cap on Schiphol, and to give other airports a chance. Why didn't your report look at that particular question, and would you have a view in relation to it? What is your view in a post-COVID era? Should we not endorse a policy of balanced regional development to give other airports, such as Shannon Airport, a chance to grow and develop and be sustainable? And it is a driver of economic activity in the Western region. It's so important for FDI, for tourism right along the Western coast. I just really want to know why the task force didn't look at that question at all or make a recommendation in relation to it. Just in relation to the travel agents, I think you have a very strong case. 3,500 people employed. I think this committee gives an opportunity to point a spotlight and to put those questions out there. I think we as a committee need to engage with the airline sector. We need to engage with government. Really following on from what Deputy Lowry said, if we were to take away 2 or 3 recommendations from yourselves, what would they be that we as a committee could pursue with airlines, with government on your behalf? So maybe Mr. Horn first, please.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy. Yes, I am aware of the Limerick Chamber of Commerce's work and the fact that they were in direct contact with me during our work with the task force. We also had, as I'm sure you're aware, the CEO of Shannon Airport, Mary Considine, and indeed of Ireland West, Joe Gilmore, as members of our committee. I observed earlier that the national aviation policy, my understanding is it has in fact expired. There's a need for a new one, and I would imagine that it entirely timely that a new national aviation policy would consider balanced regional development. I don't believe it was directly in our terms of reference, but perhaps just to remark again, my approach was to drive consensus, and so I wanted to make sure that every recommendation in our final report was supported by all 14 members of our task force. Unless there was unanimity, then we wouldn't have a recommendation in that respect. So that was my driving way that I worked. So if the committee is reconvened, I think it would be appropriate to have this in the terms of reference. But I do paint a backdrop. In fact, the national need revisit on the national, 5-year or 10-year national aviation policy should be.
We missed out on the last section of that. I think it was the best part of it, Mr. Horn. So would you mind repeating it, please?
Maybe I'll speak more slowly. Thank you for going back to me. I was just observing to my knowledge, the national aviation policy has expired. It's entirely appropriate to revisit the national aviation policy for the next 5 or 10 years. I'm sure balanced regional development should be an intrinsic part of any such review.
Thanks, Mr. Horn.
Mr. Hackett and Mr. Dawson.
In terms of the recommendations, thank you for asking. I think we've covered the point with regard to the CRSS inclusion. We've covered the point on refunds, and we've alluded to the need for the legislative evaluation around the Package Travel Directive and the EU 261. The one key thing that we would really like to discuss with you is the requirement for testing at airports, and for that in itself to build confidence in the consumer to travel again. We wish to comply with what is required to be done in terms of public health, but COVID is here, to use a travel analogy, for the medium and long term until such time as it is safe to travel. And one of the key things that didn't happen yesterday with the Council documentation and the Council recommendation that came out from Europe covered the lifting of quarantine and the implementation of testing. It still has a very patchwork, almost by its very nature, traffic lights change colour, as we know. We can see what's happened in recent weeks with regard to the case numbers, so they can move very dramatically. The level of transmission within the community effectively is transmission that we don't know where it's coming from. So we need clarity, and the one way that we can have clarity is if we create the infrastructure and the environment in our airports, having recognised the importance of connectivity to this island and the importance across the various sectors, corporate and leisure. Testing has to happen in the airports. We have to support the DAA and Shannon Airport in what they're trying to do to put that in place, and we have to see what we can do to work with the airlines. So from our point of view, we would be calling out the flaws in what happened yesterday. Yes. We would be supportive of the airline industry in terms of their criticism of what happened yesterday at EU level. It was kicked down the road, possibly because of a timing issue insofar as case numbers are increasing right across Europe. But testing at airports has to be a key factor in the recovery of travel and the aviation and airline sector.
Mr. Chairman, could I add one more comment to Mr. Hackett's?
Absolutely.
Which I don't believe we've heard this morning, and that's not to forget the insurance industry and the travel and the health insurance industry. And in terms of encouraging consumers to travel again, as Mr. Hackett was observing, I do think it's important to consider how applies.
Mr. Horn, you may just repeat just the last few words you made. You skipped.
I apologise. I would suggest that travel insurance and health insurance are important aspects in encouraging consumers to travel again in this COVID environment, being clear of what insurance is available to them. I would ask perhaps the Joint Committee, if you have the insurance industry, I think it's important perhaps to get their perspective.
And Mr. Dawson, you had something on that?
I totally agree with that, because what insurance companies, and we know the type of action that's going on with insurance companies avoiding PI and PL, but certainly from a point of view of travel insurance, it wasn't worth the paper they were written on, and most travel insurance companies said to the consumer, please go to your travel agent, they're under the Package Travel Directive and they'll refund you.
Mr. Dawson, how many insurance companies are actually in the market providing travel insurance?
I would say between 4 and 5, Mr. Chairman, at maximum.
And of those, how many of those were providing the bulk of the insurance?
I would say Blue, Accident in General, and VHI. And VHI were particularly strong in passing the book onto the travel agent.
Just obviously we have to be careful. VHI are not here, so I'm assuming that you might. That's an observation, right?
An observation, yes.
So that's something we can follow up on with the various insurance companies.
Yes.
Deputy Smith.
Thank you for the witnesses for their testimony today and their submissions and the work indeed they've been doing over the last weeks and months. I think I see this as somewhat a continuation of work that's happened in the COVID committee over the summer, and I think it's somehow unfortunate that when we have the aviation industry in, it always seems to be at a time when our own domestic pressures in terms of COVID are going in a particular direction. But in terms of tackling COVID domestically, the short-term measures in terms of if we are moving levels, it's going to take a few weeks. But we have to be clear and strong in our messaging that to get the aviation sector back up and running, which we all agree needs to happen, it's both a short, medium and long-term project. So we can't let the mood of what's happening in Ireland affect what we need to call for in terms of your industry. And in terms of the travel, if I could just speak to Mr. Dawson, Mr. Hackett first, I feel like the travel agents have been the forgotten sector within the aviation sector. And I know in your representations over the last number of weeks, you've done a really strong job of getting the travel agents into the conversation. Could I just say, have you had any time to make representations either to the Minister or senior officials in the department in relation to testing? And what was your impression of what came back from the other side of the table in relation to that? Because for me, and for others in this committee, we're blue in the face talking about testing. Last week, we had Dalton Phillips of the DAA say, we're ready to go, 15,000 tests a day from our own resources, won't impact on the public system. We can do this now, we're ready to go, give us the go-ahead. So when you've been making representations to the government in relation to testing, what have you been getting back from the other side of the table? What is it?
They have been, Deputy, they have been very silent on testing as such. There has been no feedback, and we have put it out there that certain testing is the only solution because it is certainty. And certainly, I suppose the excuse is being used that we don't want to take from the HSE testing as such, which of course Cork and Shannon Airport are not talking about that. But certainly, it has to be done on a singular thing by the airports, and without it, there's nothing going to move.
Yeah, the drivers around testing are the airports. So we would be incredibly supportive of DAA's initiative last week as to what they can do, and I'm aware of that proposal, and I'm aware that they've put this to the department, but it doesn't seem to have gone anywhere from the department. We've had very good engagement with the department on the matters that are really relevant to us. They're our line department, and they have been very helpful in guiding and directing us. But with regard to testing, it's a bit of a moot point for us because we're the travel agents. We can't actually initiate it. The airports have to do it. It's key for the airports and the airlines, and we will do whatever we can to support it. And we will also call out the weaknesses in the current, traffic light system or in the previous, green, what shade of green system that we had for travel. We've to get back to travelling. We've to get back to a safe environment for consumers. We've to look at best-in-class cases in Europe. Dusseldorf has airport testing. Frankfurt has airport testing. Rome has been awarded a 5-star Skytrax award. They have 40 biohazard staff in the airport working with their passengers on a daily basis. Why aren't we looking at these, and why can we assist the DAA in getting through their testing protocol? If they've come to you and said we can test 15,000 a day, why aren't we doing it? Because that will provide the certainty you would hope for the medics who have genuine concerns in this area.
Why isn't it happening?
I have no idea, Deputy. It's the single biggest inhibitor to travel being restarted in this economy across all sectors.
Give us your honest opinion as to why you believe it's not happening.
Possibly it's timing and the case numbers going high, and I don't understand some of what we're doing in this country because we seem to be on solo runs on so many issues, and travel is one of them.
What do you not understand that we're not doing? And I'll give you plenty of time.
No, I'm happy for this to be
I look at a country like Italy, which was pandemic central back in February, opened for travel on the 3rd of June, inbound and outbound, and has done so successfully and safely, and continues to have lower case rates than what we have. So we have lockdown, we have closed travel, we have closed pubs, we have effectively closed entire sectors of our economy to no massive avail in terms of where we are seeing our community transmission rates going. And that has to come back to, if we're calling out community transmission, we're acknowledging the fact that we don't know where the cause of the infection has come from. That's not good enough when we're 7 months in and we have an economy in free fall.
Mr. Chairman, I think, and the medical profession are doing a wonderful job, as we all know. But I think travel is like a bad word to be used. If people, like, you're a pariah if you travel. Or, medical people said travel is this and travel is bad news and so forth and so on. So certainly that is being kept, and the government up to now has certainly listened to that. But certainly, there's, if you look at the COVID app, they used to be stuck for 3 months, travel 2%. It was just thrown in there as a number. There was no scientific numbers to it at all as such. So certainly, with our engagement with them, certainly testing was never even on any agenda whatsoever.
But we can get back to travelling safely if we provide the testing environment. Like, we have case studies from customers who have travelled through Frankfurt and Dusseldorf airports for business recently, and they have compared the total dichotomy between Dublin Airport and these 2 German airports that are maintaining their connectivity and providing a safe environment for the consumers in which they want to travel. So, we've got to move on this. It is somewhat ironic that we're, treating travel as a pariah, and we have 14-day quarantines in this country, and yet we can all travel north of the border where the case and the infection rates are far higher, and we can fly out of Belfast, or we can return into Belfast, and we have no quarantine requirements. So there's anomalies all over the place here. I appreciate we've never been in this position before, but we are where we are. We have the DAA coming in and suggesting that they can put this in place. We are dealing with, the single largest indigenous sector of employers in Ireland in terms of tourism, inbound and outbound. Not just what we do outbound, but inbound, the Hotel Federation, the restaurants, the cafes, the attractions, all across the country, 270 to 350,000 people employed, depending on who you listen to. And if we can resolve safe travel and reintroduce safe travel by getting testing happening in airports, we need to do that.
Yeah, look, I don't know much more to add. This is the issue. It knits everything together in the aviation sector, from the travel agents through to the airlines. It'll keep workers in work. Like at the moment, I'd feel safer having someone coming from Italy through a testing regime in the airports now than I'd have someone from my own home city of Dublin coming up to my house, given the level of community transition. That's the way it is. And we keep saying timing. The minister said in August that he was early August, that he was looking at a testing regime for the airport. We're over 2 months beyond that now, and they're still silent on it. My own personal observation is that there is a blockage at NEFIT on this. That's my own personal observation based on testimony that we've received. And what we're all asking for as public representatives, as representative bodies from within the sector, is not travel at any cost. I don't want to see planes go up in the air in a reckless fashion. I want to see safe travel, because it'll reduce the stigma of travel. Because I have it. If I see someone on social media who's away, like I have that instinct reaction, like, what are you doing going away? But if I know there's a testing regime, that goes away instantly and will allow travel to take off. And we're going to be here again week after week. And we're seeing no signs from the government that this is going to change anytime soon. I'd like to thank the witnesses. I'm sorry I didn't get to Mr. Horn, but I think that testimony is very important that we just heard there.
And maybe Mr. Horn, just to add to it, Mr. Horn, when you were in your Aviation Task Force report and your committee, did you consider, I know you made reference, did you consider testing at airports in depth? And you might just give you've heard the comments here just now. You might give us your overall perspective in terms of testing fitting into the revitalisation of the airline industry, in particular in the context of our airports here in Dublin, Shannon and Cork.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Indeed, we did, and we felt it was critical to restoring consumer confidence to fly again. We made our third recommendation was specifically about nationwide comprehensive test and trace, and that we felt that at the time, and this was back last June, that the system was underinvested and under-resourced, and that if it could be addressed nationwide, it would increase the consumer confidence to travel. So we felt that routine testing, I quote, should be a cultural norm and provide public reassurance. So we absolutely did, and would fully support anything which increases the ability for test and trace.
Thank you. Senator Sullivan, do you wish to participate? Okay. That's okay. I'm going to limit this to 5 minutes. So I'd start with Deputy Carl Crowe, and then we'll move on. Yeah, within reason.
Thanks, Chairman. So just the issue I wish to speak to Mr. Dawson and Mr. Hackett on is that of pseudo flights. So for the months of May till about late August.
You talk about ghost flights?
Sir,
flights?
Pseudo flights. I think there's a difference, actually. I know there's been different terminologies. The ghost flights is where you had the whole refund issue.
Yes.
Both Aer Lingus operated these pseudo flights where you'd go on and book, but they never flew them, and they will refund you. So I'll just explain, if you don't mind, Chairman.
Please,
from their Shannon base, Aer Lingus continued for about 10 weeks to advertise daily flights, 3 flights a day actually from Shannon. They were up there the whole time long. You could go in and book, you'd pay, and then about 10 days later you get a follow-up email to say that flight isn't actually happening, and will refund you. So it was to the dismay of the travel planning a journey. The refund for some people still hasn't come through. Some of them have taken 6 months to date. And I think it was amoral for Aer Lingus in that period, with no intention of flying whatsoever, that they would have continued to take bookings at a time when a lot of people are hard pressed for cash, taking money from them, promising to reimburse them, but delaying that process. So there was, if you look at what happened nationally, there was an inflow of cash to the airline. Not much, because bookings were certainly hugely down. There was certainly consumer cash coming into the airline, being held up within the inner organs of that airline and be reimbursed on a very slow basis.
Just be conscious that Aer Lingus are not here to
Yeah, absolutely. I've had this. I'm more than happy to keep going in this vein, if you don't mind, Chairman. Yeah. So I think that's quite apart, and it's quite distinguished from what Ryanair were doing. Ryanair were flying and challenging, putting up to the consumer, we're flying, fly with us, or or else we won't be in a position to refund you. I would like to ask you, was that Aer Lingus position where they flew for those 10 weeks and have delayed a refund process, was that damaging also to those in the travel agency sector? Because I'm sure you were booking people in that period, not many people, but I'm sure some people booked in that time. Could maybe Mr. Hackett respond to that maybe?
I think the level of booking during that time was so low for us that it wasn't really an issue. I'm not aware of the practice going on much, to be perfectly honest. And that's just calling it as it is. I'm not doubting you for 1 second in what you're saying. I'm just saying it wasn't apparent to us. The only thing I could kind of allude to is that at the start of this pandemic, the level of uncertainty as to when things were going to change or how things were going to restart, or flights restarting, may have had the airlines, and they were very close to 1, 2, 3 weeks before departure, making changes to schedules and roster changes to schedules, and they were, for the most part, doing their best to keep us up to date. They were putting flights into the system that they probably hoped would operate. I don't know that there was malice in it. The refund should have been processed at this stage, but we didn't. I think it would be fair to say, Pat, that we wouldn't have seen it as a serious.
If you went to a travel agent, we would say, please don't do that, because that flight, we would know that flight wasn't going to go. But people who were online directly themselves, they wouldn't have been aware of it. But as Paul says, there wasn't really much of that we could give out about, no.
I was told by Aer Lingus, to our two witnesses, that it was testing the water, but I think the only way you can truly test the water, you could do that once or twice, but over a 10-week sustained period, to be continuously cancelling flight after flight, it has damaged the brand of Shannon, I would say, over that period, and a lot of people just reverted back to Dublin in that time as well. The very last thing I just want to say is I absolutely agree on your points you've made regarding testing. The only way I think people will with confidence board a flight is knowing that those in front, behind them are COVID-free, that they'll be tested at the point of departure and probably at arrival as well. So you exit that arrival hall, book your car, go to your hotel, wherever you're going, COVID-free. Are there any other measures you believe that would instill consumer confidence, as we face into the coming months?
I think that alone, in terms of travel, is the single biggest ask and the single most translatable result. Like when you look at yesterday, what the government are willing to spend on the budget yesterday, what is it going to cost in terms of testing and tracing? And if we can do that, how quicker and how more effectively can we ensure that the money we're spending for the state, actually pays dividends?
And Mr. Chairman, as you know, we need to get this country back working. We need to get, airplanes in the sky. We need to get our inbound and our outbound tourism up, because, as Paul says, it's costing millions every day, and it's small money when it comes to testing. So that has to be done. And the pressure, I would ask this committee, please put pressure wherever you can to get testing going.
I think what we'll do, and it's a team coming up. We clearly write to the Minister around the testing. He's in before us next week in the estimates. I think we'll do a specific committee meeting purely on testing. We'll bring in whatever witnesses we require. In fact, we'll invite NEFIT. We will invite the department, whoever we believe is required on that specific issue. And we look at it in an empirical way. And I think really what's required here is that and we will then, so I would be looking that we'll do that as quickly as we can. Deputy Smith?
If I could offer maybe, and I'm not sure if there's an individual out there who would be available, but if there is someone who's involved in implementing a testing regime in the European airports, if they could...
We'll do a body work ourselves to decide who we bring in as witnesses. We'll hold public hearings specifically on this issue, and time is of the essence. So,
Mr. Chairman, if we can be of assistance at any time, we'll help.
Deputy Corry?
Mr. Chairman, could we look at trying to get a witness from that airport in Rome, where they're actually,
Absolutely. It's a body of work we'd have to do in private ourselves. It'll be a comprehensive meeting. I think it's coming through today from Mr. Hackett, Mr. Dawson, and Mr. Horn in that area. I think it's a body of work we can do together.
And the GAA are members of
International
Airport Associations. They will be able to pull in the people from the airports.
Our role as a committee is to do a constructive bodies of work specifically on testing. It needs to be done. Senator Buttimer.
Mr. Chairman, I think arising from today, can I wholeheartedly endorse that we need to bring in NEFIT, we need to bring in Minister Ryan, but also Minister Donnelly, in the context of
I think we probably have to look at the issue around testing, and particularly flights. appears to fall heavily in under the Department of Foreign Affairs. We'll have to invite as Minister Coveney as well.
Well, it is about testing, and it is about ensuring, as our two excellent witnesses here today have said.
Three.
In terms of the actual experience, and then come back to Mr. Horan in a second, in terms of the whole issue of restoring confidence in the travelling public. And in terms of Mr. Horan, it is, I believe, about him being available to continue his role as chair of the task force, so that that task force can be reconvened. I think the other point, Chairman, for us as a committee is that we shouldn't be afraid to re-invite the airlines in.
Correct.
In the context of the refund issue we've heard this morning from our witnesses here, but also, I think, to acknowledge the work of our Irish Travel Agents Association and the many people who are working in that very important sector, who have been given the short straw through no fault of their own. I think the other point that we need to look at, Chairman, is this. It is about the issue of re-establishing confidence in a safe manner, but from our perspective as a committee, I don't think we should be afraid to have this as a piece of work that's elongated rather than short, because this is a very important matter. But can I just thank all of the witnesses for coming in this morning? Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy O'Murrocoe.
Is that on a clock?
No, you can ignore that.
No,
Senator Buttimer very much observed brevity, so he's providing good example.
I commend you, Senator. In relation to testing, I think we, in fairness to Senator Buttimer, he mentioned the fact of possibly Minister Donnelly, but either which way, Minister Donnelly last Thursday spoke about HICWA carrying out these antigen pilot tests. And to me, that was being sold as a means of dealing with this solution. Now the question is why it's taken so long to start it. So, but if that's the process that we're going down, well then.
Well, I think I think there's a body of work to be done.
But I'm going to include, but HICWA, I think
Absolutely.
need to be in and not just someone from HICWA who has particular information in relation to, obviously, to that.
We need to do a comprehensive short-term body of work on this.
Because I said it earlier, I'm slightly annoyed at the answer we got on Wednesday from Ministers Ryan and Naughton, and we all got a science lesson in relation to testing and what's good about antigen and what's not. And in fairness, then because Minister Donnelly got a question the next day, he said, we're about to operate pilot schemes. So I would have thought that information should have been brought to us earlier. Anyway, that's done. Just very quickly, can I ask the insurance difficulty that was spoken about earlier? Because it was I met with a number of travel agents in Dundalk fairly early on, and what they spoke about was when things actually got back up and running, that people obviously came and for, let's say, essential travel or whatever reason, and when there was a green list, bought tickets, bought packages, went, and then obviously the area they fell off the green list. And I know that travel agents were worried that we are wholly responsible now. If this person gets sick, we're on the hook for it, even though, they've chosen to go themselves. We've told them and informed them that what you have booked is now an area that is no longer in the green list. But it was once again, travel agents found themselves in an absolutely brutal scenario.
And it comes down to the travel guidance and the travel advisories. Yeah. The insurance applies when you can travel within Department of Foreign Affairs advice, and DFA advice pretty much since the start of March has been against non-essential travel, and then we had the green list. But the green list is similar to the traffic light list. There's no certainty. It can change so quickly that doesn't give consumer certainty. It's not going to resolve the issue of rebuilding travel and restarting the aviation sector and the tourism sector in this country.
Just for simplicity, to get travel insurance.
Sorry, yes.
What's the criteria that you require to get airline travel insurance?
Well, to get travel insurance, you just have to purchase the insurance.
No, but is it so at the moment, will you only get it for essential travel?
You will only get it if it complies with DFA guidelines that you can travel. Yes, it will only be the insurance company will honour their commitment. Sorry, I misunderstood the question.
Yes.
The insurance company will honour your travel provided your travel in compliance with DFA guidelines.
But am I correct in what the travel agent told me, that if somebody buys when it's on a green list then like let's say the destination falls off the green list, as an individual, that person decides to travel, but if they were to get sick, etc., whatever, that there's a responsibility then on the travel agent. That's the way they sold it to me. Is that an issue you're aware of?
Well, the travel agent is ultimately responsible
Yes.
at all times, but in terms of the insurance can actually go from being in place to not being in place.
I accept that in relation to
That's a separate legal arrangement outside of the arrangement with the travel agent.
Yes.
That's arranged between the person travelling and the travel insurance company.
Exactly.
Depends on their terms and conditions.
But again, like it's falling into a pandemic type scenario. Previous cases that this would have been a terrorism attack in one particular destination where the insurance company and the DFA would have said, we don't want travel to this destination because it's a terrorism risk. It would be very defined. Here we're dealing with such a global scenario. It's just proving very difficult for all of the providers.
No, I accept that. I suppose I was just making the point when it was made to me. It was just another situation
yeah.
where travel agents were falling between multiple stools.
Again,
and
it comes
falling
back to the
hard.
package travel directive.
Yeah.
That was, dreamt up in the 90s.
Thank you. Can I just conclude and just to summarise, first of all, to thank Mr. Horn, Mr. Hackett and Mr. Dawson for taking the time to attend our committee.